We're joined by Daniel Shadmy. He's a spokesperson for ELNET Israel. Mr. Shadmy, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Right, good morning. So we hear, obviously, on a daily basis what is going on, and we hear different perspectives of what's going on in Gaza. But what happens when the war is finally concluded? What happens to Gaza and people who live there at the moment?
Ideally, and that has been repeatedly mentioned by both security officials and government officials in Israel, Hamas will no longer be in charge of the Gaza Strip. And hopefully, Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip will be able to have a leadership that does not oppress them and controls them freely.
Yes, but how will they select this leadership? I mean, will there be free and fair elections? And are they even possible?
Hopefully, yes. I think it's going to be something that is more difficult than just turning into democratic elections just on the day after. It's something that will need some time and a process. And for that, there is need to have international support for an alternative leadership in the Gaza Strip. And for that, we need some sort of agreement on who that alternative should be. But there must be a different leadership in the Gaza Strip for both the security of the Palestinians there and the Israelis.
Right, and but now focusing also not only on the leadership, but now let's take a look at the bottom of the ladder, because the root cause, I feel like it's very difficult now to pinpoint the root cause, and we do see that there is definitely hatred there that has been ignited for decades, and that it has been now we see harvest of that hatred. So how do you feel like now, how do we address the root cause of the conflict to create a more stable and secure Gaza Strip? Is this even possible?
I think we must believe that it's possible. We must have the hope that it's possible. And the main way, and it's also something we believe in at ELNET, the organization I work for, is education. We need to find, and Palestinians need also to find, a leadership that will start a process of educating new generations that we must live side by side. And none of us are either going anywhere. So there's need to be a way of building trustworthy mechanisms and an alternative leadership that does not call for the death of all Jews can come through. But it needs to come with a lot of courage, and it's not going to be easy. But there must be a new upcoming young leader that must take upon himself that, or herself, that task of educating new generation that violence must stop.
Right, Mr. Shadmy, does the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority have a role to play in what happens in Gaza? And if so, what?
That's a good question, because it has been said several times that the only alternative currently, according to several defense officials, to Hamas in the West, in the Gaza Strip, is Fatah, the PA. Now, unfortunately, Fatah is also an organization that promotes hatred towards Israelis and Jews by their school books, but also by praising terrorists that have committed terrorist attacks. But the PA must have a role because they are now the ones in charge in the West Bank. And there have been calls to reform that PA. There needs to be a new leadership, and potentially over time, through a process that with the trust-building mechanisms, there might be a possibility that the PA might have a role in the Gaza Strip in the future. Unfortunately, they do not want to enter, I'm using quote marks, the Gaza Strip on an Israeli tank, as Mahmoud Abbas had said. But if we want an alternative to Hamas, a somewhat more moderate alternative, they must reform themselves as well with international backing in order to have a role in peace-building mechanisms and to kind of start a process to end the violence that we are seeing currently.
You mentioned international backing, so what role can international cooperation now play in shaping the future security landscape in the region?
So it is also something that we call upon at ELNET. We work on strengthening relations between Israel and Europe. Now, the Europeans have been very involved, even if it's only in the political discourse regarding this conflict in the past 7 months. What's important is now to come and be a partner for both sides, for all of the sides, in order to create a good ground for a ceasefire agreement that will release all hostages. Some countries have called to unilaterally recognize the state of Palestine. I don't think that this is something that is kind of constructive. What we need to have is international partners that come and hear all sides and mediate and be part of a process that might lead us in a few years, hopefully less, to a situation where we all live side by side. Unilateral decisions will not be somewhat helpful, but calling for a reformed Palestinian Authority, for example, that does not call for terror, and that might be an alternative for the atrocious Hamas regime that is currently in Gaza, that could be a good start. Calling for freeing the hostages in the Gaza Strip that have been in tunnels in the past 7 months will lead Israel also to rethink, I believe, their military operation in Rafah, for instance. So calling for freedom of civilians and for organizations that are in charge to less use languages of terror would be a good beginning.
Well, it sounds as though it would, Mr. Shadmy. You mentioned the hostages. What's the latest news on them?
From what I believe has happened, there were intense negotiations just up until they blew by a PR stunt made by Hamas, where they supposedly said they have accepted a ceasefire agreement. However, they have accepted their own ceasefire agreement that they have proposed to both the mediators and to Israel. And then this was in order to prevent a very the IDF operation in Rafah. Now, Hamas has not been very upfront and a good player in these negotiations, where I believe if it had simply released civilian that they hold hostage, including kids and elderly, for 7 months in tunnels in dire conditions, I believe the ceasefire agreement and the cease of hostilities, at least temporarily for a few months, would have been the case before the Rafah operation.
Understood. So, I mean, everyone's waiting to see what happens in Rafah, Mr. Shadmy. Clearly, there are some humanitarian concerns, despite the efforts that the IDF have made to get civilians out. How do things stand in terms of humanitarian aid to Rafah at the moment?
The humanitarian aid that has been going into the Gaza Strip in general has been flowing in hundreds of trucks per day through the crossings. One of the closest crossings to Rafah is called Kerem Shalom. The day before the operation, the very pinpointed operation of the IDF in Rafah, Hamas has fired rockets towards that crossing that is only goods crossing and killed 4 Israeli soldiers that were protecting that crossing, from which, again, humanitarian aid has been flowing into and towards Rafah in the southern part of the Gaza Strip. Now, there have also been reports that Egypt has also closed and reconsidered the amount and the goods that are going through Egypt towards the Gaza Strip. Just in some quantities, if I'm not mistaken, the pier that has just been built by the U.S. forces in Gaza to allow goods to go in, it equivalates to somewhat 50 trucks a day of humanitarian aid, whereas the amount of trucks that come in from Israel towards the Gaza Strip amounts to 500. And we've seen pictures and information that flows that Once the aid comes in, it sits in UN logistical warehouses because they don't have the capacity to redistribute it well within the Gaza Strip. I think there need to be more efforts done inside Gaza where UN agencies or NGOs, independent NGOs, help redistribute that aid so Hamas wouldn't take hold of them and withhold them from Palestinian civilians.
Right, well, a logistical nightmare on top of everything else. Mr. Shadmy, thank you very much for taking the time to lay all of that out.
Thank you for having me.